So again, I thank everybody for your patience, and I apologize profusely for this. So basically what I wanted to start out with today, and I was able to hear some of the conversations while I was muted on the call-in. So I did hear a little bit about if people had experience in the patient diversity space or anything like that. But I just wanted to kind of start off with the first slide is our event focus and the things that we're going to be discussing today. And I'll give you a little bit of my background. So my name is Mary Brantner. I have been in the pharmaceutical and medical device industry for well over 30 years. I am a ClinOps person by training and history. I started out as a CRA working for a medical device company. I worked for Becton Dickinson for many years of my career before moving over to the pharma industry. So I've moved through different types of roles in the industry, and my most recent last two roles that I had was I have headed up global development operations for Daiichi Sankyo outside of Japan, and I'm currently heading up a clinical program optimization team at Insmed Incorporated. And one of the reasons why I'm speaking to you about diversity is because in my role and the areas that I've been able to cover, I've really found this to be something that speaks to me. It's something that I really have started to take on as one of my own areas that I want to focus on. So for probably about 3 years or so, I've been doing diversity work on the side with the organizations that I've been employed by, helping to set up plans and things that we could do differently in order to make sure that we have diverse populations in our trials. So that's one of the reasons why I was asked to walk you through this today. So again, the focus is going to be very high level. So you can go through patient diversity training that is 1 day, a half day, several days. There's a lot to take into consideration when you're doing this. So we're not going to have time to touch on all the different aspects, but we will be able to at least give a foundation of guidances, information about what some of the sponsors are doing, why we really should be looking at diversity by people who are involved in clinical research. So if you wouldn't mind, we'll go to the next slide, please. And as you can see, again, we'll be going over diversity as a whole, but this slide also has a disclaimer from me. So the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are mine only and do not represent those of Insmed Incorporated, the company by which I am employed. So the next slide is the learning objectives. We don't need to go through those again because we did just kind of go over those at a high level. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So let's start with the next slide is what. So what is patient diversity and what is currently going on outside in the industry? This is not meant to be comprehensive of every single guidance, everything that's been published, everything that's been documented on diversity. But what I wanted to focus on was more where the agencies have been going. And I'm really focusing on US-based in this particular discussion. We're not talking about globally. We're not talking about in EMEA and Europe and in other regions. So we will focus on the FDA guidances. So these are really the 4 main areas. You've got 3 guidances and you also have 1 act that have come out. And this is anywhere from 2016 to current state. So you could go to the next slide, please. So when did all of this start? So the first time that the FDA really put anything into writing was in 2016, and that was when they issued a guidance on the collection of race and ethnicity data. They followed that up in November of 2020 when they issued a guidance on enhancing diversity of clinical trial populations. Then in 2022, there were 2 things that were happening, both the DEPICT Act and the FDA issuing their draft guidance on diversity plans to improve enrollment. And in 2024, we expect that there's going to be a finalization of the draft guidance on diversity plans. And I'm going to go into each one of these in a little more detail now. And again, please interrupt if you have questions. If anything comes up on chat, Dhruvi, please feel free to bring a question up as we're going through.
Sure, will do.
So the next slide is what the guidances and the act require. So the 2016 draft guidance, and I believe these slides will be shared with you afterwards, where you see anything in blue, that's a hyperlink. That's going to take you directly to the guidance itself. So in 2016, when the FDA issued the guidance, it was really looking for sponsors to collect and report demographic information. So any of you who have touched on any type of clinical trials or who have been involved in collecting any type of information around demographics, these are the standard things that you've seen in most clinical trials. It breaks up groups into race and ethnicity. There's major categories that will be listed. It'll say, are you Caucasian? Are you Asian Pacific Islander? So this was something that sponsors were pretty much readily able to take into play. It also recommended for the first time that a sponsor submit a plan to the FDA early in the development stage to talk about the inclusion of other diverse populations. And they want you to have these conversations with them no later the end of clinical phase 2 meetings. But the guidance itself actually didn't go all the way. It recommended things, but it actually didn't include the actual level of inclusion of racial and ethnic groups in clinical trials, or that the clinical trial demographics precisely mirror the US population. That's one of the things that we're going to see in some of the later acts. If we could go to the next slide. So then in November of 2020, the FDA issued the Enhancing Diversity of Clinical Trial Populations. This included eligibility criteria, enrollment practices, trial designs. So here they were trying to give sponsors even more information and ideas about what they should be doing when they're looking at the clinical trial. So it really provided what the agency was currently thinking about broadening eligibility criteria in clinical trials. They were telling you to look at different ways to do it. So it's not just saying what percentage of people do we need to get in each of these ethnic groups or races, or what it was actually asking people and sponsors to focus more on is what could they do from a trial design or a methodology approach. They were helping to say by looking at things differently, you can increase enrollment of some of these underrepresented populations by the way that you change your designs and the way that you're going to conduct your trials. So one of the things that they brought up that they thought we should be trying from a sponsor perspective is starting to look at things like visits. So again, any of you who may already be involved in clinical research, or it's an area that you're thinking about going into, we often find ourselves looking at how many visits we're actually asking somebody to come in and do. So back in 2020, the FDA was also encouraging sponsors to look at that. How could we reduce the burden a little bit? Could we change visit frequencies? Could we add things like more flexible visit windows? Do we always have to have people come in? Could you do something over the phone? Could you do it email? Are there other ways to get the information that you really need rather than making somebody travel to the clinical site? So this guidance also included high-level considerations about other groups. So it wasn't just looking at race and ethnicity. It started to talk about what about women, including pregnant women. In the past, you may have heard that often women were excluded from research. There were multiple reasons why people were excluding women, especially pregnant women. Sometimes in very early research, you're not quite sure what the impact of the compound is going to be on the body, and they didn't want pregnant women or women that were breastfeeding to actually be able to send over any of the pieces from the drug over to the baby or anything like that. So they were really being very, very protective of the women, especially the pregnant women. It also said that we could start looking at children, maybe looking at older adults. Sometimes there are additional issues with older adults. They have underlying health issues, so often they are not included in clinical trials. So the agency was really encouraging sponsors to look outside of the standard age range and the standard Caucasian male group that most of the clinical trials were being conducted in. To go to the next slide. So some people felt that the FDA wasn't making strides as quickly as they should. So there was a group that actually had brought forward from a legislative perspective what's called the DEPICT Act, the Diverse and Equitable Participation in Clinical Trial. This was proposed back in February of 2022, and this was taking everything one step further. This was making it actually a requirement. So sponsors would be required to submit a diversity action plan with their investigational new drug or investigational device exemption applications. So those types of applications are the first thing that you put in with the FDA before you start a clinical trial. So before you are ever to give any participant in a healthy subject study or a patient-based study any new drug, you have to file your IND before you do that work with the agency. So in this DEPICT Act, they're asking for the report to have to include things like enrollment targets. That hadn't been asked for in the past. So what are your targets? How are they broken down? And also a plan for how someone as a sponsor is going to meet the target. So they wanted the agency or the sponsors to start to really think about, what are we committing to? How are we going to get there? What are the things that we need to do in order to make sure that we meet the requirements of the plan that we're putting forward? It would also authorize the FDA to mandate post-approval studies or post-market surveillance if a sponsor didn't meet the diversity target enrollment and didn't provide a justification for why they couldn't do that. We're going to go into these two types of post-marketing commitments a little bit later, but basically what happens when you are given a post-marketing approval or surveillance requirement is after the FDA approves your drug or your device to be sold, you could still be required to track certain things and report in safety information to the agency. So this is what was happening in this particular act. They were saying that the FDA would be able to require you to continue to study your drug even while you're selling it if you don't meet these diversity targets. It gives you more time to meet them, but it's an actual requirement. Like FDA tracks it and you have to do what they've asked you to do, or you put in jeopardy the approval that you currently have for your compound or your device. We go to the next slide, please. So in April of 2022, the draft guidance came out, which was diversity plans to improve enrollment of participants from underrepresented racial and ethnic populations in clinical trials. This is the one that really seemed to have the most impact on the industry itself, and people were taking the most serious. So we're going to talk in a little more detail about this. Again, it was issued in April of 2022, but final comments are still out and being collected and reviewed by the agency. So that's all going to close in December of this year. And then the expectation is sometime probably in first quarter of next year. Some people are saying it'll be late March. It could actually be the first week of April that we're going to see a final issuance of this draft guidance document. So once that goes out, the agency now will have the ability to actually look at sponsors and ensure that they're meeting the requirements of this. Usually we try to do that anyway, even when it's in a draft state, but once it becomes final, it becomes even more imperative for us to do that. So one of the things that this draft guidance requires is what's called a diversity plan. So if we go to the next slide, this is one of the areas where a lot of the sponsors are currently focusing the work that they're doing in diversity. They're creating a formal document that has these 5 sections. In these sections, they have to take the clinical trial that they're actually beginning to undertake and plan and break it down and make sure that they've explained all of these areas to the agency in the plan. Again, the expectation here is that you'll be having conversations with the agency at the end of phase 2. And I guess just as a point of clarification, not knowing everybody's experience level with clinical trials, when you get into phase 2 trials, you're really looking at the dosing and the effectiveness of the compound that you're looking at, if it's from a drug study versus a device study. What you want to do is be able to lock down exactly what the dose is when you're getting ready to move into a phase 3 trial. The phase 3 trials are the next step where you're going to a broader population, and these are the trials that are often called pivotal trials. These trials are the ones that you're required to complete in order to gain approval from the FDA. There's always exceptions to that. There's orphan drugs. There's other areas where sometimes a phase 2 can also be used for approval. But in general, you would have these conversations about diversity with the agency during your phase 2 work that you're doing. So the areas that are covered are an overview of the disease or the condition. So they really want people to look at the pathophysiology of the disease, so that we're making sure that we understand how it may affect the safety and the effectiveness of the product, especially in these underrepresented groups that we're looking at as part of the plan. There's also a scope for the development plan. So they want you to describe the trial, how they may specifically address inclusion of underrepresented racial and ethnic populations. And they also want you to talk about any findings you might have from clinical pharmacology studies, so PK or PD studies that you may be doing. And again, just for a point of clarification, clinical pharmacology, PK, PD, one is the impact that the drug has on the body. The other is the impact that your body actually has on the drug. So we're required to look at these as we're going through the drug development process. We need to include goals for enrollment of the underrepresented populations. So similar to what you saw in some of the acts and some of the earlier guidances, they want the sponsors to really look at what are we going to do from a planning perspective? What percentage of different types of populations do we want to look at? So oftentimes people will look at the epidemiology of a compound, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well in future slides. But they're trying to tell us here, don't just look at epidemiology alone. Let's make sure that we're looking at other opportunities and areas that we can evaluate. We need a specific plan of action to enroll and retain these diverse populations. So this is one of the things that has become very important, is when we're looking at how we can attract people to actually participate, one of the things that tends to get in the way is often there's barriers that we may not be thinking about. Sometimes it's that the sites are just too far away. There could be things like language barriers. Sometimes we can do things to overcome those barriers, like community engagement. We can try to reduce trial burden. Maybe, again, we talked about the visits earlier. Can we decrease the number of visits? Can we decrease the number of procedures that we're asking people to actually sit and undergo? So all of these are supposed to be taken into consideration as well. And then there may be a status of the enrollment goal meeting that you may have to have. So you may need to discuss along the life of the clinical trial how you're doing in comparison to the enrollment goals that you actually had put forward. So again, some trials can run many, many years. So there may be points where you need to update the agency and make sure that they're understanding how you're performing against the goals that you've said that you would per your diversity plan. So before I kind of shift to, this is another type of section or another direction. Does anybody have any questions about the guidance documents, diversity plans, anything like that at this point?
There's one question in the chat. Is there a template version of this plan we can use from the lens of the recruitment team, not sponsor?
So there actually is no template that's been issued by the FDA. And one of the things that a lot of the sponsors are struggling with right now is creating a template for themselves to use. How much should we really include? How much do they really want to know? So unfortunately, there is not actually a template. What I believe we will probably see is more things showing up on the internet in the next year, let's say, I'm sure there's going to be groups that are going to be offering some of these templates that they've used, some of the bigger pharma consortiums that they have, maybe using one across all the different pharmas. So there is not one currently available, but it would not surprise me that we don't start to see some popping up on the internet sometime in 2024. Anything else? Okay. All right, so the next slide would be, what is the impact to approval? So people often say, well, if it's a guidance document, what does that mean? So do I have to follow it? Do I not have to follow it? So everybody follows it from an FDA perspective. If they're taking the time to put it out there, we should be following it. What we're seeing right now is that the 2016 guidance regarding the collection of race and ethnicity data in general was readily adopted, and I talked about that a little bit. It wasn't a major change for sponsors, so people just started to put it in as standards for the type of data that they would be collecting. It also helps ultimately when you report results to the agency, because they also like to see demographic information. So this really got everybody using those standard categories, and this way you could also compare the demographic information across different drugs, across different programs, so it provided some consistency. The 2020 guidance falls in line with the direction that many sponsors were already going. It added the element of considering patient burden and the inclusion of diverse populations beyond ethnicity. So this was kind of happening at a time where there was already a push within the industry to make that happen. And I think the FDA just wanted to make sure that they were helping to provide some type of ideas, guidance, guardrails for us to follow as we started to go down that path. Then the April 22 guidance, even though it's still considered a draft guidance, the FDA has actually been taking into consideration when reviewing the new drug applications. So the NDAs are the final piece with FDA before you potentially have an approved drug. That's when they either approve or deny your approval for a particular compound. What we've been seeing is that they've been doing this a lot in the new oncology compounds. So the oncology group, there's a subgroup within FDA that works in oncology space. And in that group, they're finding that a lot of the different compounds that they've been putting forward, FDA started looking at already for diversity information. If you go to the next slide, this is a little bit old, but it's one of the most current things that's out there right now. And I've also put references at the bottom of all these in case anybody wants to look a little bit more into any of this. So this was published just back in November of 22, but it really talks about information from anywhere from 2021. So just to give you an idea of what the agency was doing in the oncology space. So there were 123 oncology drug approvals during this time frame. There were 15 what's called a PMR, we talked about that, post-marketing requirement, or PMC, which is the post-marketing commitment, that were related to diversity. And they were called out in FDA approval letters when they were assessing the different compounds. These are just a couple of the ones that they actually, an example of some of the ones that they actually did have requirements for. This is a breakdown by indication. And if you look at the next slide, slide 13, you've got a table here. And again, I only pulled out 3 of the 15. This is just meant to be an example. But you'll see that in 20 and 21, these 3 oncology compounds, they all had accelerated approval, which also means that they were going through the approval process a little bit quicker, and they had additional opportunities to have conversations with FDA during their clinical trial conduct. But you'll see that all of these have comments under either their PMR or their PMC that highlighted that they needed to include, they needed to do more to include sufficient number of racial and ethnic minority patients. They also talked specifically about the one on the bottom, about toxicities. They wanted to make sure that they had enough information regarding the risk of serious adverse events, including any hematologic toxicities in certain racial and ethnic populations. And they called out specifically Black patients in this particular PMR as well. So we'll go to any questions on that before I go to the next piece? Okay. All right, so the next slide, why is patient diversity critical to drug development? So even if there wasn't an FDA or any other type of health authority mandate, patient diversity still plays a key role in drug development. So one of the things that we've learned as researchers over the years is that there's instances where genetics actually do play a role in the drug metabolism. Sometimes it can inhibit metabolism, other times it can accelerate it. So it's very important for us to understand those differences when we're developing the compound, because we need to be able to really let the healthcare providers understand what the impact is going to be to their patient population. So this is important information for us to have. During the clinical trial stage, we can identify the populations where the disease being treated is prevalent and gain insights into the efficacy of the drug in these populations. So this really gives us an opportunity to look at who ultimately is going to be treated by these particular compounds. And when you look at that, do we have to worry about anything from an efficacy standpoint? So if you do it early in the clinical trial stage and you're getting a representative population, then when you go out to the larger population, you should already hopefully know some of the things that you might see in regards to the efficacy of the drug or any safety issues or anything else that you might be coming across on that particular compound. So the next slide, what are sponsors currently doing to ensure diversity in their clinical trials? Again, these are just some of the things that I've seen, some of the things that are coming out in conferences. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list or the only thing that people are doing. But what I see is there's different levels of proactivity among the different sponsors. So there's some who have kind of seen the writing on the wall and have said, we're going to have to do this. We're going to do this for multiple reasons. Maybe it's a requirement from the FDA. Maybe it's because we want to know more about the populations that are going to be given our drug. Maybe it's because they just felt it's the right thing to do. Some of those groups, and these tend to be in some of the larger pharma companies, have actually built full departments, and they're addressing diversity in the clinical trials. So they do all kinds of work in order to ensure that at the end of their trial, they've got the diversity that they need, and they're really understanding the patient population for the disease state that they're treating. Other groups are just beginning the journey, and they're not even planning on finalizing their action plans until the 2022 draft guidance is finalized. They're waiting for that final nod from FDA to really understand what FDA wants them to do, and they're going to compare that to where they were going and what they still need to do in order to meet the needs of that particular guidance. Other groups have chosen to take the approach of building their diversity efforts to reflect the culture and using the 2022 draft guidance as a minimum of what they will commit to. So these types of organizations are saying, hey, we recognized, several years back that this is something that we needed to be doing. So we've started to do that already. Our culture is that we want to make sure that we get the proper, safe, efficacious compound out to the patient population that actually needs it. And by focusing that way, the belief really is that they'll meet the spirit of the guidance no matter what. And they're probably going to do a lot more than what the guidance requires them to do. They'll, of course, double check with the final guidance, but they really have started to plot their path for their organizations by just doing what they believe is the right thing. So some of the more comprehensive efforts that I've seen and I've come across, they've already started creating those diversity plans. So they're starting to template those out. Some companies have even had conversations with the agency around the plans that they've created. Again, that's a little more in the oncology space right now, but it is actually happening. They also look to identify clinical trial sites that are located in different geographies and have different ethnic populations. So getting away from these are the sites that we've always used, or these are the key opinion leaders and they're the only ones that we're going to go to. They're looking at it and saying, what can we do to get into some of these different regions, different areas, different sites? Maybe they're just starting research at a particular institution. Maybe they're well established, but they haven't been used as much as some of the larger academic organizations. So how can we look to some new places to actually be able to run our clinical trials? They're also starting to look for more ethnically diverse clinical site staff. So there's a lot of momentum right now, and I'm sure that there's been some papers published to date that talk about the fact that people tend to be more willing to participate in a clinical trial if the person that is approaching them about it looks like them, reminds them of them. So really they feel, I guess, a little more at ease, we'll call it, right at the beginning when they start to have those conversations. So if you start to look for those ethnically diverse clinical site staff, that also can potentially feed into your ability to recruit a more diverse population in your trial. You can also support community outreach efforts to help educate people regarding the benefits of participating in clinical research. So we've also found that this is one of those historical barriers to try to overcome. There's certain ethnic groups that are just shy, or they shy away from doing clinical research for whatever that reason may be. It may be past history, it may be just a lack of confidence. There's lots of things that feed into this. And a lot of groups, both from a sponsor perspective and from groups that are helping private companies that work in the diversity space, they're finding that really creating that community outreach program is helping. So by going out and educating people about what clinical research is like, telling them where they can find the clinical trials. That's also another thing that we haven't talked about yet, is sometimes it's very difficult for certain populations to even know where to start to look for clinical trials. It's not something that they're accustomed to. They don't hear about it a lot in their particular area or community. So bringing those messages out of this is what clinical trials are, trying to help allay some of the fears that people may have about joining trials. But you can't go out and just hit a community all at once and say, hi, we are so-and-so sponsor, we want you in our trial, come sign up. This is a lot of background work. It can take months, years to develop that sense of community. So a lot of groups are going out and just trying to help with health work right now in different populations and areas. And then if people also participate in clinical trials as they become available to them, great. But it's more about just trying to make sure communities are understanding. And another thing there is often is groups are building solutions to overcome the barriers. So we talked about that already, but things like travel cost, availability of trials, convenience. One of the things that I found very striking, I was at a conference probably just a month ago, and one of the speakers, you'll often see patients or people who have been in clinical trials speaking at a lot of different conferences. This was a rare disease conference, and the person who was speaking was probably in her late 20s. She suffered from an ailment that caused tumors to pop up on her body consistently. She was going through, I think the final count she gave us at that time, she had already had over 20 surgeries to have different types of tumors removed. They're painful. They're unsightly for her as well. So there was multiple reasons that she had, a lot of, she spent a lot of time trying to see what she could do from a clinical trial perspective or investigational medications in order to try to change the trajectory of the disease that she currently had. She was younger at the time. I think she said she was in her early 20s when she came across the clinical trial. And she agreed, she signed up, she started the work at the institution. And then when she had done a couple visits, She was leaving for, one visit, and they told her in preparation for the next visit, she needed to come in with a urine sample. Now, it wasn't one of the little urine samples like you see in your doctor's office. For any of you who have done urine clearance and creatinine clearance, this is a big jug of urine that they wanted her to bring back. They gave her instructions and a certain amount of time that she needed to collect that urine. Well, she was young. She didn't have a real income coming in. She didn't own a car. She asked them, could you pay for me for a taxi to bring this here? And they told her no, that they couldn't pay for a taxi. So she was struggling to figure out how she was going to bring it. They said, just get on a bus and we'll reimburse your bus fare. So she said she went home and she said, I am not going to spend 2 days collecting my own urine to take a large jug of urine, even if I put it in a bag, on a bus to travel 45 minutes for a clinical trial. She's like, I can't do that. So she ended up dropping out of the clinical trial, even though she had all of these pains and, emotional things going on, and she really wanted to try this investigational compound because that was just something that she couldn't do. And I obviously would never blame her for that. But from a site perspective, it's good to think about things like, if I just pay for an Uber, if I just do this, they'll agree to stay in the study. So for her, that was a deal breaker for her to continue in the trial. So we'll move to the next section, which is really kind of our wrap up.
Sorry,
when we're
Mary.
looking at oh, go ahead.
There is a question.
Sure, go ahead.
What is your opinion around sponsors waiting for the 2022 draft guidance before building their diversity efforts?
I think that they're going to be scrambling, and I think that they're not necessarily going to be as comprehensive as they should be. They might meet the needs of the guidance document, but the guidance document is really just a starting point. I think that people need to look at why diversity is important for your clinical trials, rather than I'm doing this just because it's now an agency mandate. And I think that that really is what gives you the best end product and does the best that you possibly can for the patients. Again, just my opinion, but I feel that they're going to be struggling, and they're going to have to look at it a little differently for it to really be successful. Any other questions?
No, that was it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So kind of as a wrap up, I wanted to leave you all with a thought about what we can do as researchers to promote the diversity efforts. So if any of you on the call happen to be at a clinical site, you may want to consider what we talked about, the broader community engagement, getting out there, teaching and educating about clinical trials, and making sure that people understand, what it entails, why it may potentially be helpful for them. You may also want to look at filling new positions with staff that reflect the ethnicity of the patient population that you treat. It's not to say you should take someone who's a less of a caliber in that particular role because they're one ethnicity over another. But if you have two potential candidates that are equal in all ways, you may want to look at that and say, is this a plus for me to bring in somebody who is Asian, because we have an Asian population, and that might help them to feel a little more comfortable when they come in. When you're reviewing a clinical trial protocol to determine if your site will participate, look for the barriers that would prevent you from enrolling a diverse population. So again, all sponsors are going to do this differently. So when you're looking at your protocol, you may pick up things and then you may think, why are they doing this? Like, haven't they thought about this? Make sure you give that feedback back to those sponsors who aren't considering, can we pay for that Uber instead of making somebody take a bus? Or, we can't have somebody come in on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 4 hours each of those 3 days, and they live an hour away, so they're driving 2 hours. You know your populations, the patients, so, you should definitely give feedback on things that you see in the trial protocols They cannot always be changed, and sometimes they come too late in the game. But I think sponsors are also trying to get better about engaging people from the site before finalizing a first protocol. So if you have the opportunities to do that as well, it's a great area where you can influence and help provide some of that real world information back to the sponsors. If you're a sponsor company, you have to make sure your company is meeting the requirements of the guidance. You need to look closely at the epidemiology of the disease you are studying. So one of the things that we do right off the bat when you're starting to look at, where are we going as we start to plan for this trial, is looking at the epidemiology of the disease state. So there's going to be no requirement from FDA to enroll a 20% Black population if only 3% of the Black population has your particular disease state. So what you need to do from a sponsor perspective, or really anybody who's writing a protocol around something like this, is to say, what does that epidemiology look like, and then try to match it. You're not always going to get the exact number from your epidemiology, because sometimes there's patients who have either gone undiagnosed or, they haven't been treated appropriately. So you may not always be able to get the completely accurate percentages, but at least it gives you a ballpark. You'll know, do I need 5% of this specific ethnicity, or do I need 40%? So that's really where that comes into play. And that's where you need to start up front and looking at who you're targeting. You also need to incorporate the needs for patient diversity into your planning and well ahead of treating your first patient. So this is something that you don't think about it, 4 weeks out from dosing your first subject. You have to start to think about this a year out, sometimes even longer than that, depending on the trial and if it's a rare disease versus a more common disease. So definitely something to take into consideration. And continue to look for the removal of those clinical trial barriers. You can tell that's definitely one of the underpinning thoughts here, is that impacts everything. So make sure you guys look at those. And also select sites based on geographic location, ethnicity of their patient population. There's also not necessarily a correlation of saying, if I bring in an Asian investigator, he's going to enroll an Asian population for us. That's not always true. You need to really start with, where are these sites located and what is the patient population itself, and then look back and see, what that investigator is actually being able to enroll from his patient population directly. So don't make the mistake of always saying, because a physician or whoever the investigator may be, nurse, whatever, don't make that correlation of they must have this population because they are such and such. Look at the patient population and geographic location. And I think that wraps it up for me. It's my last slide. Apologies for going through that a little quickly and trying to make up the time. And again, I profusely apologize. I'm usually 5 minutes early for everything, and I started at 10 minutes to 1 and I could not get on, or 10 minutes to 12 and I could not get on. But does anybody have any other questions? Anything else I can help?
There's one more question in the chat,
Okay.
or something that someone wanted to share. I just finished participating in a clinical trial as a patient for a large pharmaceutical company. I've received no written information outside of the limited information in the consent, and this was an incredibly complex drug study. The clinical site coordinator often told me incorrect information and didn't know how long I would need to be at the site for each visit. I am a healthcare professional, so was able to get through it, but there is no way anyone with a lower healthcare literacy would have been able to do it. Just wanted to share.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And, I am sure that that occurs a lot. So again, I think it comes down to the sites that you select, and I think it really is the sponsor's responsibility to make sure that the staff that is conducting the trial is well-versed. They should know these things. They're trained on protocols. Maybe something had happened and they hadn't had a visit lately from the sponsor, or sometimes we use what's called a clinical research organization, or a CRO, to help monitor the trials. And if that's the case, there should be additional education and refresher training that happens. So no, thank you for that input. And I'm sure that that does happen, and we've got to do better as sponsors to make sure that it doesn't, and that people, you know, are educated to what they're getting themselves into when they sign up. Anything else? Anybody else? All right.
I have one comment to make.
Sure.
And so in my experience, I've been working in clinical research for now over 26 years. And in my experience, I've seen sponsors basically overlook sites where the PI is a minority simply because his site is within somewhat of a close proximity to another PI with whom they have a relationship with. And I just don't understand that, because both physicians are pulling from a totally different patient population. And if we're truly seeking diversity, I don't understand why they're not, basically taking advantage of that.
Right, right. So you are 100% right. And I think that that's the mind shift that has to happen here. I think that we need to get out of we always go to these 20 sites whenever we do this type of trial, because that mindset is
Exactly.
a typical pharma mindset. I need to enroll my trial. I only have this much time to enroll it, but we need to think about it differently. The mindset should be, how do I get the right patients into this trial? How do I make sure they get exposure to that? And by doing that mind shift, it opens you up to thinking about multiple sites in the same area, looking at competition, of course, but making sure that, you know, the investigators understand Dr. Smith and Dr. Jones are both doing it, and they're within 10 miles of each other.
Exactly.
But they draw a different population. So I'm behind you, and that is something that I also try to push to, is let's look at, and we also need to give some of these smaller sites and some of the new investigators an opportunity, or they're never going to learn. So we also need to help teach them about clinical research and how they can do well-run studies. I think that's another gap that we have, is sometimes we don't have people that are able to conduct clinical trials because they just don't have that background in some of the areas where the population sits. So what can we do as sponsors to help raise the bar for them and help them understand what research is, and kind of do some hand-holding with them for their first couple of trials?
Love it.
But yeah, I'm behind you.
Yeah. So, okay, very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I wish
this.
I could have seen all of you and you could have seen me, but at least this worked and we got through the content. So I appreciate everybody putting up with me today.
Well, we wanted to say thank you so very much for joining us. We really greatly appreciate it. It was fun and educational material. And I wanted to also thank everybody else for attending today. And we appreciate you staying on, and we hope we answered some questions. And outside of that, we will let you guys go and have a wonderful rest of the day.